Book 3. The Council of the Ages. Chapter 8. Part 3. New cheers in the room at Ferdinand's announcement. Who waited patiently for them to cease to continue speaking and for the two magi to stand next to the other heroes of the council. Well, however, it is essential that a priest consecrated to Elaban come to Itzamir on the expedition. There is only one person who meets the characteristics for this mission. Arian, the high priestess of Elaban. To ensure their participation, the Council of Magicians has hired the Blue Phoenix Company to participate alongside the heroes of the council in the Itzamir expedition. There was not much applause at Ferdinand's announcement. As representatives of the Council of Mags, the mercenaries advanced hesitantly and placed themselves next to the heroes of the council. Many of them were annoyed to have to share the glory with some mercenaries. It was an insult to their honor as noble warriors. A group of assassins, orcs, many had been disowned by their own before being mercenaries, and now it was their turn to fight alongside the noblest of all Sharnaris. Broke Black Gem squirmed in his chair when he saw his daughter there. Adrian bit his lips in the presence of Agnorok, as did Reginald I, with whom he also had unfinished business. Aris, the butcher of Tortanel, with his father. Many elves hated him to death, but also the envoy of the Black Empire was uncomfortable in his chair. Gabler, however, watched Kush with some admiration. Enrich smiled maliciously at Paulana. The elf just wanted the earth to swallow her up for being next to this group of warriors so hated by everyone. The murmurs did not stop at the surprising declaration of the Council of the Ages. But for the great king to doubt an order of his was one of the gravest breaches of his sacred authority. Silence! The room fell silent at the great king's shout of authority. The council has decided. The heroes of the council and the mercenaries of the Blue Phoenix Company will gather in 4 months at the kingdom of Lemuria in Zeldonas. They will leave 2 weeks later for Itzamir to end the threat of the demons of the Black Abyss. Aris and Ziranak looked at each other and smiled without saying anything to each other. Tanya lowered her head. She couldn't keep the hateful look of the Annihilator. She had survived her brother in the massacre of the Blood Mines and now fought with the assassins of the entire legion of Danka Attar's brothers, betraying her own. The king's deformed daughter was a traitor. Her father whispered something to an advisor. Well, before we conclude this council and the embassies depart for their homes, I will offer a great dinner in honor of the heroes of the Council of the Ages. With this announcement from the King of the Elves, the meeting in the Hall of Creation was concluded and each embassy went to their chambers to dress in their best clothes at the farewell banquet. They were summoned at sunset. They dined outside in a forest next to the Avenue of the Kings. The tables were under huge trees with large spaces between them, richly decorated with garlands filled with colored lights with pink and bluish tones. The banquet tables had a different layout from that of the first dinner. There was a large central table with a lectern and the rest of the tables around it. As always, the chamberlain indicated the placement of each guest. Arian and Aris were placed next to the kings, but not at the same table, but at the front of the table with a lectern. The rest of the mercenaries were placed on a table on the periphery of the park next to a pond where the 2 moons were reflected. King Amistral sat at the lectern table with the heroes of the Council of the Ages. Arian was sitting at the king's table on the far left next to Ferdinand and Iria, his assistant. Anenko declined the invitation to dinner. He had a lot to study in the library. For the elves, the mercenaries did not deserve a place of honor. They were paid for a job, but they did not deserve any tribute, although if it were a company made up only of humans and half-elves, they would surely be next to the heroes of the council. It was not the best deal, but they decided that the Last Supper would pass in peace. They swallowed their pride and enjoyed as much as possible. The music was pleasant and the food was exquisite. They had drinks, fruity wines, dwarf beer, flavored water, starters, salads, cold soups, canapés, roast meat in different ways with honey, fine herbs, tomato sauce. The mercenaries as always monopolized the food and drink. although this time it was with a narrow margin with respect to the rest of the guests since the atmosphere was much more relaxed than at the first dinner. Paulana stayed in the room alone without dinner. She was not invited and she was not hungry either. It was his last night in his homeland. A land where he had never been happy, but which had given him everything he had. The dinner was not long delayed, as most of the embassies were scheduled to leave very early the next day. The music stopped to beat the drums, indicating that King Amistral was scheduled to speak to close the council. Thank you, kings of Mercenaries. This council has marked a milestone in the history of Mercenaries. We have forgotten our differences and quarrels to try to collaborate in the face of the great threat that looms over us. But I hope that this conciliatory attitude will continue after the threat is over. May this crisis be the beginning of a new era as important as the Age of the Gods, where all together we lay the foundations to achieve great prosperity for our peoples. Applause and more applause. The Council of the Ages was the beginning of a new attempt to return to a new golden age in Mercenaries. The choir of the first evening returned to perform again. This time the song was much more cheerful. They sang in Elf and the dancers danced to the sound of the music. The dance increased the rhythm like that of the song until the waterfall of creation was illuminated. It was an offering to the gods so that all the members of the council would have a good trip back to their homes. When they finished they withdrew to their chambers. Agnorak reached Paulana's height, who was sitting in the garden watching them clear the banquet tables. Here. The half-orc offered him a series of rolls and some cold meat and some fruit cakes. Paulana was surprised at the half-orc's gesture. This is your last dinner, enjoy and rest. Tomorrow a long day of walking awaits us. The elf tasted the unexpected dinner and then tried to sleep. Tomorrow she would leave for a destination unknown to her. At dawn they had breakfast. The Grand Chamberlain gave them a letter with instructions on how to meet within 4 months, although if there were any news they would contact them. Ferdinand himself would go to Almera to sign the contract with de Boek and formalize the hiring of the mercenaries to participate in the expedition of the Council of the Ages. Once the nuances had been clarified and all the provisions for the journey had been obtained, they set out. This time there was no hurry to move and they went on foot instead of on horseback despite the king's offer to give them mounts for their journey and an escort of elven knights. As they were about to leave the border of their native kingdom, the banished Paulana turned her head to gaze one last time at the plain of paradise.